Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Oh, y'all sound a little bit perky. Look like 6:30 works better. All right, so tonight we're going to go over company secretarial practice. I know when I asked last time, some people mentioned that they actually perform this function. Is that anyone on the call now who performs secretarial duties? No? Welcome, Shalisa. We did miss you.
Good evening.
Yes, we did miss you.
Apologies for my my not being in class. Dealing with a few things on my end.
Oh, okay. Well, you were missed.
Happy to be back.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's good to hear. So we're gonna do company secretarial practice tonight. So as we go through it, if you have any questions, you could ask. A lot of people like this role. It's a part of the financial corporate service providers. One of their functions that they provide, which is providing company secretary services. If you work in an organization and if they have nominee companies, they would normally again ask you to be a secretary on a meeting for one of his nominee companies, or depends on your role, you could actually be a corporate secretary or an assistant secretary for your actual company. So it is a very demanding role. Pays well, but there is a lot that you would need to know in order to carry out the function properly. So with that said, let me get started. So let's start. To be a company secretary, you need certain qualifications. And those qualifications are you don't really need to have a legal background. You could probably do a paralegal course, but you really have to understand the business that you are in. So that's the first thing. You must understand the business that you're in. And you have to know all the legal and the regulatory requirements around that business. You have to know the risk that is a part of that business, being in that business. And then you also have to know your responsibilities or responsibilities of the company from a corporate governance perspective. Calling a meeting, how proxies work, how to prepare an agenda. You have to be able to read properly, and you also have to have a little understanding of financial statements, because you're going to be responsible for drafting the agenda and also making sure that all the requisite documents are presented. The next part is you're going to have good oral and written communication skills. And with that, you have to be detail oriented. And that detail oriented doesn't mean that you just are able to write things properly, but you have to be able to retain things. And you have to be able to tell the board when they are not following procedures. So that means that you must know the memo and arts for the company and how the company is to be run. So the next thing you need to know is you have to have good mediation and team building skills. And you have to know how to do consensus building. So you're the person that sits next to the chairman, and you're the person who will then look to see who's best seated next to who. And you're the person who's going to say, okay, I see these two directors can't get along when they sit together, so you're gonna have to move them, or be able to give the signal that these two directors are actually they're battling with each other. So that's another skill you're gonna have to have. You have to be able to think critically, and you have to overcome bureaucratic thinking. So you're the person who's going to guide the chairman as to what the argument is about between directors, or if a director poses a question towards a member of management who's done a presentation. So all of that, you have to have certain skills and be able to pinpoint these things as you sit in the role of secretary. Any questions so far? You have to have strong leadership skills also. So you can't be a corporate secretary and be very, very quiet, because the chairman is relying on you to direct procedures and to give advice when necessary. So what are the duties and responsibilities of a company secretary? One, you have to maintain the statutory documents. And you're also responsible for keeping the company corporate seal. Your next duty is you have to make sure that all the statutory filings are done. So normally you prepare a checklist, depends on whether it's a Companies Act company or an IBC company, and you prepare a checklist as to what needs to be filed and when it needs to be filed. You're also responsible for giving advice as to different requirements under the Companies Act. So let's say if a company wants to change its name, you should be able to tell the chairman what is required according to the Companies Act, or what is required according to the memo on arts. The company secretary also have to ensure that dividends are paid. And so the company secretary should know when dividends should be paid as per the Companies Act, as per the Articles of Association, and also as per the regulatory requirements. Whether under CBB, under the insurance, under the Securities Commission, under gaming, you have to know what are the rules. You also have to assist with drafting agenda, the minutes and the resolution. You have to know when to affix the company seal, and you need to know when you need to co-sign with the directors. You also act as a confidant and advisor to executive and non-executive directors. And you also have to ensure that the company holds its AGM within the specified time period. That's in the Act. You also have to organize and administer board meetings and shareholders meeting. And that includes the notification, drafting the agenda, and make sure all of the requisite documents are attached for approval or consideration. And of course, you have to prepare the minutes, and you also have to draft the resolutions. Any outcome after the board, of course, you have to communicate that to the relevant person. And you also have to communicate any decision or deliberations that the board makes to the various departments or organizations. So if you start from that point of view, let's say, how would you define a secretary? After listening to the roles and responsibility, how would you define a secretary, a company secretary? First, you know that they are appointed by the board, and they have to ensure that the company is always in compliance with the regulations, the legislation, international best practices They have to know about corporate governance. They're the ones that keep the board informed of its legal responsibilities. And they act as the midpoint between the board and senior management and the shareholders and anyone else who's a part of the corporate structure. In some instances, they act as an advisor to the CEO and senior management on corporate governance affairs. So really that person is normally a senior person in the organization because they have to know company law. They also have to know a little bit about legal work. They have to know about corporate governance. They have to know what are the statutory and regulatory requirements for the business that they are in. They normally advise the board how to conduct corporate governance reviews. They would also assist the chairman with doing board of directors reviews. They would also assist when a company needs to make corporate statements. And they normally assist with, let's say if you have investors, again, they're responsible for vetting the communication that goes out. So before you go more into, or we go more into the role of the secretary, let's think about what is the purpose of the board of directors meeting. And the purpose of it is to agree on a strategy for the company. And then you have to assess the effectiveness of that strategy in the subsequent meetings. Once you've developed a strategy, then you have to set a policy, and that policy should be clear and relevant to the operations of the company. Consideration should be made if there are any issues around the implementation of the policy. You have to do at least write out a plan on how you're going to implement it. And that's through every department. And that's end to end. If necessary, if you need external advice, you need to seek the advice. And you also have to ensure that the company has all of the requisite procedures and policies in place. In particular, you're going to look at the health and safety of the organization. If it's a securities firm, you have to make sure that you have actually gotten all of the requisite approvals, or you have all the requisite frameworks in place. The next thing about the board is you have to actually create subcommittees. It depends on what business you are in. There are many different kinds of subcommittees. You could have a subcommittee for risk. You could have one for nominations. You could have one for balancing assets and liabilities. You could have a committee for credit. There are lots of different committees. So normally when you have a committee of the board, usually a board member sits on that committee. And that board member would report to the board. So normally, when you think about a committee, there's certain things that have to be put in place. One, the committee needs a constitution or a charter. You have to define the membership, the frequency of the meeting, who will be in attendance, who will be guests, where the authority came from to create that subcommittee, what are the responsibilities of that committee, and also what reporting is required from that committee. So normally, because the board doesn't want to spend too much time on dealing with certain matters, it will create subcommittees. Now, what is the role of the board and the purpose of the board meetings? The role of the board and purpose of the board meetings is one, you must have the right strategy. So the board has to ensure that the right strategy is in place and that strategy is being executed. So you cannot have management carrying out one strategy and the board discussing another strategy. And you also, in carrying out that strategy, you have to make sure that you have a processes in place to develop and monitor that strategy. So that's the first thing you need, but that's the first role of the board. To make sure that you have a strategy is being executed, and then you must have a process to develop and monitor that strategy. What you don't want is a board that sits around the table and discussing historical information and not looking to the future. The second thing for the role of the board is having the right resources. And that's the part that senior management plays in making sure that the appropriate resources are in place that fits in with the strategy. And that comes with hiring the right people and paying them the right salary. The next thing about the role of the board and the purpose of the board needs to ensure that the company complies with the appropriate laws and regulation. Because of course, you know, there are fines, there are penalties, and depending on what happened, board of directors can actually go to jail. So that's three things now. Being on the board, you have to be cognizant of. So to be a director, whether you're executive or non-executive, you have to have great judgment. You have to have good interpersonal skills. And of course, you have to be able to listen. So when you're selecting directors to sit on a board, it's just like team building exercise. You have to make sure that you have the directors that's going to help you carry out the strategy. And so you cannot get three directors with the same background. They need to have different backgrounds, different ages, different sexes, so that you have a balance. Once you get a board that is too comfortable, which means that one person says yes and everybody just agree, then there's danger because the company will not grow. Any questions so far?
No, ma'am.
No? Okay. So there are 4 key board roles: the chairman, the chief executive or the managing director, the finance director, and independent directors. So how often should a board meet? Normally a board meets once a quarter, but normally the chairman along with the corporate secretary sets what you call the board calendar. And they do this by planning and allocating the time. So best practice is normally to set a calendar for 2 years. Some people do it monthly. Some people have meetings quarterly. Some have it semi-annually. The length of time for a board is based upon the items to be discussed. Usually it's not good to have long board meetings because that means that you've taken away from the focus of what the meeting actually is about. Sometimes it's good to hold meetings in the actual place of business, and sometimes it's good to have meetings outside of the business. So people have a better chance to think clearly. They don't feel rushed or pushed. And sometimes it's good to be outside of the organization because then it gives independent directors a chance to look beyond just the company itself and think more of understanding what the business is and what's the best approach to helping the business to grow. One of the key things about being a corporate secretary and fulfilling this role is you have to know how to set the ambiance of the boardroom. You have to make sure, one, that the room is not stuffy. The room is not overcrowded with chairs or books. You have to make sure that the color of the room is pleasant. People feel at home. You have to make sure before the board meeting starts that all the plugs are working, the lights are working, the room temperature is good. And you have to make sure that, let's just say that there is work going on the side of your building, and you notice that it's very loud. You then have to take the next step to go and advise them that you have a meeting coming up, what time the meeting will be, how long it will take, if they could refrain from making noise or drilling, whatever that they're doing. Then you have to think about where will the directors sit? And the company secretary is responsible for assigning the seats as to where people should sit. Normally for the first two meetings, you allow people to just to sit wherever they want to sit. And then you have to look to see where the synergy is. Because sometimes some people do not get on well with others. And sometimes you can see that two persons probably just sit in the whole meeting and just talk rather than contributing to the meeting. So you drive who sits where. Now, normally there is a preferred seating. The chairman and the vice chair normally face each other at the end of the table. The secretary normally sits on the side of the chairman. So they sit between the chairman and the finance director. Because don't forget now, most of the talking comes from the chairman, most of the contributions come from the finance director. And that's another way in which if you're sitting between those two key persons, you are able to give prompts. You are able to see if there's anything that is missing or if there's a document that the chairman is referring to that you need to have access to or remind the directors where they can find it. The chairman always has their back to the window and they're always able to see the door. Because don't forget, being the secretary, you need to know who's coming in and out because you have to record it for the minutes. The CEO and the managing director sits next to the chairman, and that's for a particular reason. By the CEO sitting next to the chairman, it denotes that there is unity. Rather than sitting 2 seats down, they speak with one voice. Don't forget now, when the agenda is being prepared and drafted by the secretary, the chairman will have a conversation with the CEO as to which matters remain, which one will stay, how long will it take, what the chairman is looking for in the documents to be submitted for discussion. Normally, you don't have non-executives sitting together. You space them out between the other directors. So the chairman, the vice chairman, the CEO, the finance director, and the company secretary, normally their seats do not change. The only time you change seats is if it is a morning meeting and you're having breakfast, then people can sit where they want. When the meeting starts, then they have to sit to their assigned seats. And the same thing for a lunch. So what information is required before the board meeting? Before the board meeting, you have to ensure that the board receives the board package in time to read it, ask any questions if necessary. So what does that entail? That means that based on the agenda, you have to ensure that each department and whoever is responsible for that department prepares that submission in time for you, the company secretary, to review it, for the CEO to review it, and then you upload it in the board data control, there are lots of different softwares you can use for board meetings. Everything now is electronic. And so the company secretary uploads it under the relevant tab. Automatically, the chairman can see the document. If there are any changes to make, the document can be taken down, corrected, and uploaded again. So whenever you're writing to the board, the information have to be accurate. It has to be concise. You have to provide whatever supporting documentation that the directors will need if they are required to make a decision, or if they're required to give a proper debate on the matter and then come to a decision. Usually the latest document should be uploaded in a board package is 1 week. If you are sending a lot of policies for approval, it's normally 2 weeks. In most instances, you don't send a board just words. The words have to be short and succinct, and normally you would add a graph or a table to it, but it becomes clearer. Sometimes it's easier for board members, once you've presented a certain document to a board and you notice that they have difficulty either in the wording or the way in which it is presented, sometimes it's very good for the next time that document is presented to change the format so that there is less confusion and board directors will have a better understanding of what management is trying either to relay or to seek guidance or to seek approval for. There are in some jurisdictions, I know Canada for one, where the board package is separated in two. One is where you have policies, and the other one will be matters that actually require a discussion or debate. So the first part of the board package will be static documents where they will just say, we agree, we approve. The other part of the package is all of the documents that have to be discussed or debated upon. And then a resolution is passed. So normally for a board meeting, there's an agenda. Normally you try to put that agenda on one page, but it depends on the size of the organization and the nature of its business. It can run up to 3 pages. You have to include the minutes from the last meeting. Again, that depends on the length of the agenda and the items that were discussed. You also have the accounts and then any other document that relates to a specific agenda item. So normally, as a company secretary, if, let's say, operations has to prepare a report, it is the company secretary that will give the guidance as to what should be in the report, how long should it be, how it should be written. So they actually give the purpose for it, the background, what is the issue, and what is the recommendation. Normally, is either to inform, to present, or communicate, or you're seeking an approval, or you want a discussion and guidance from the board as to what are the next steps. Any questions? None so far? So what should be on an agenda? So normally, the secretary would draft an agenda after having a preliminary discussion with the chairman. The secretary would then forward that draft to the CEO for any input. And then it goes back to the chairman for the final approval. Normally you try to focus more on strategy and a balance between that and operational policies. For the chairman, he has to have that art in how to balance the board and the matters to be discussed at the board meeting in order to get the outcome that he's looking for. So typically, the agenda, the first thing is the welcome. Then there is notice of the meeting, quorum. Then you have the approval of the previous meeting, the minutes. The secretary would have already made notes from the last minutes, all of the matters that are arising. Then you could move in the actual agenda. Normally, the next item is usually the accounts, the financial accounts. Then you'll have the executive report. So you have the accounts first, and then you could have the written report on management. Any policies that need to be approved. Any strategic issues. And then any other business. Could anyone tell me what normally goes under any other business?
Would that be like items that would have been proposed by other
For any
members
other business.
before the meeting?
Now, when you say before the meeting, you mean when?
Like when the agenda and package first was circulated and a board member came back and said, oh, I would like to put forward this item for discussion. Would that be added as its own item or put under any other business?
No, it depends on what the item is. Normally under any other business is once the agenda has already been approved and there is another item that needs an approval and it cannot wait for the next board meeting, it goes under any other business. That's how it's usually done. Because directors really don't like matters and round robin, because it doesn't give them the opportunity to discuss it. So even if you brought a matter, the agenda was already approved, and then you got to put it under any other business. If you want to have the discussion, then you can, and then you could send around the resolution for their approval. But it's really any other business is to capture an item that was not included under the agenda originally. So being a chairman requires another set of skills. And they also have to make sure that the board has sufficient time to read before they come. If you're sending out large documents, you cannot send those out 2 to 3 days before the board meeting. That means that the directors would not have had sufficient time to read it. There's no time at the board meeting to read it. And you cannot say at the board meeting that, okay, we'll discuss these at the next board meeting, which is another quarter. So that's why the corporate secretary has to press on the various contributors to the agenda that the documents are received in a timely manner. So normally, when you have an agenda, what's a good practice is to write down how long you think each presentation will take. And then you could put on the side of it how long it actually took, and then whether or not it needs to be cut down or not. So normally I'll tell you what I normally do. If you're having a meeting, there's an agenda. I normally ask persons, let's say if they have a PowerPoint presentation that's 36 pages with graphs and slides and all that. I always advise them to type out what it is that they're going to say. Because if you allow them to speak, they will speak on every slide. So something that should have been for 15 minutes ended up being for an hour and a half. Of course, you know, by then all the directors are asleep. So it's always best for them to type out the salient points, the points that you want the directors to take note of and give the reasons why. So it's really the highlights, because it is expected that they would have read these documents before they came. And if they have questions, they can raise questions at that time. So like I was saying to you earlier, in large companies, the agenda is split in two. Items that just requiring approval, but no discussion. And then the agenda that requires a discussion. And that also makes the board meetings much shorter. So to prepare a board calendar, you have to make sure that your specific items are discussed at the appropriate time. So normally when you know the nature of the business, you know in which quarter you have to discuss certain documents. Always you have to make sure when you set a date that you provide sufficient time for that department or that contributing department to get the information that you need in order to have it prepared in time to be submitted for the board. You also have to make sure that there's no repetition and make sure that the agenda is set very simple and it's clear. So normally, like I said earlier, a secretary would normally plan the meetings 2 years in advance. And that's to ensure that because directors sit on more than one board, they already have those dates already assigned for your organization. So there's no excuses that they cannot attend. So when it comes to managing the meeting, that's the job of the chairman and the secretary. They have to focus on compliance, make sure the minutes are prepared, make sure the corporate governance is being carried out, make sure the proper procedures are being carried out. The chairman concentrates on the conduct of the meeting itself. The secretary focuses on procedures. So what's the role of the chairman? The chairman has to organize the composition, the business, and efficiency of the board. He has to lead the board in determining the strategy and the achievement of its objectives. So, you know, once you have a company, the shareholders have lots of different initiatives, but the chairman has to make that decision on which strategy the company is going to follow, which one will be second, which one will be third. They have to ensure the board has the accurate and clear visibility of the results achieved. So he has to be able to obtain from senior management the results of the strategy, whether or not the company is hitting the mark or not. He has to be able to get from senior management whether or not the path that they're on in comparison to their competitors, do they have a good advantage? They have to make sure that all of the committees that support the board are properly constituted, composed with the right people, holding their meetings at the right time, and that they're getting minutes from those various subcommittees. They have to make sure that the relationship are maintained with all the major stakeholders. So they're talking about with employees, with vendors, with the directors, with managers. They've ensured that the company's public standing and image overall. So that means that the chairman has to make sure he reviews the website. He has to ask whether there have been any complaints that are material that should be brought to the board's attention. He makes to make sure to develop a strong working relationship with the CEO. And he also has to ensure that there's a clear definition and agreement of the division of responsibility. So the CEO needs to know his or her role, and the chairman needs to know his or her role. And normally with the chairman, that person has to command respect. It has to be a person who's very strong, not just in demeanor, but strong in terms of knowing the business, knowing company law, and how to lead a board. The CEO runs the company and the chairman runs the board. And the CEO allows the executives to join in debates. So sometimes if the board members ask a question, the CEO may invite another member of management to come in to discuss it. And normally the CEO and the chairman either sit face to face or by telephone or by email. They set the agenda. So there are no surprises. Again, there's a clear line between the two. The CEO cannot set the agenda alone and then give it to the corporate secretary. The corporate secretary prepares it, sends it to the chairman then sends it to the CEO to ask, is there anything you wish to add? Then it goes back around full circle before the chairman says the agenda is final. So what's the role of the finance director? Remember I said earlier that the finance director has the most contribution. Why do you think that is? More than the CEO.
Because they want to know the company's making money and actually doing well. And so
Exactly.
finance will reflect that.
Exactly. So whoever is the finance person, the CFO, they have to know the numbers. They have to know the numbers. And along with that, they have to know all the regulatory requirements when it comes to finances. And they also have to know all of the accounting rules, because they are the ones who are going to guide the organization as to whether what they are doing is correct. So the finance director supports the CEO, and they should have high caliber and high integrity. They have to ensure that the financial controls and systems are effective. They have to make sure they have adequate resources for short-term and long-term needs. They also have to make the board fully aware of the company's financial position, how the company is performing, and the viability of the future of the company. They also have to talk about the good relationship with providers of finance. So that means that if there are certain functions that are outsourced, they have to speak about those outsource arrangements. Are they providing as agreed in the service level agreement? And they also have a team that is qualified, appropriate for the function, and highly motivated. So they need self-status. They need to be active and a contributing member of the board on issues other than finance. So they need to add some value to the organization. They shouldn't just know finance. They should be able, when other contributions are being made, to be able to take the topic and make a comment from a finance perspective. They have to be able to communicate well on financial matters and have an appreciation of the company's financial position. So that means that based on the strategy and the implementation of that strategy, the monitoring of that strategy, they as the CFO should be able to tie in their financial performance with that financial position. That person also have to have a very good reputation externally. Because in most instances, the CFO is the second person in charge of the organization. And so they must have that respect externally from the company. And of course, they have to be able to provide the board with insightful analysis from which to make key decisions. So the CFO, when they present their financial decision, they're the ones that give the board the information that they need as to whether the strategy is working, whether the company is actually performing properly. That's their role. So what's the role of the secretary? Normally, in most companies, a corporate secretary will tell you that they do everything that the finance person won't do. Normally, the finance CFO would normally delegate things to the company secretary, which are things that are procedural or things related to company law. They tend to stick just to the finance rules, and that's it. So a corporate secretary have administrative tasks. They have some legal work to do. If they don't have a legal background, they'll be liaison with an attorney. They normally in a senior managerial role. Sometimes they have a joint job in another department. So it's not just being just a company secretary. And normally it depends on the size of the organization. The company secretary role can take up a lot of time. So they would provide advice and guidance to directors, letting them know their obligation and their role. If they are an independent director, they will tell them what are their responsibilities. Try to give them an estimated amount of time that they need to focus on the board documents. I normally recommend to company secretaries to prepare a corporate handbook for new directors. And in that handbook, you would give them a copy of the memo and arts, the goals and the vision of the organization, its strategy, a copy of the chart of the existing board of directors, an internal org chart of management and the staff in the various departments. It depends on what the company is. You could write 3 or 4 sentences on each department of their role in the organization. Then you would give a listing of all of the policies and the frequency of approval by the board and who is responsible for preparation of those documents. You would also include in that handbook the latest audited financial statements. You would add in that handbook a copy of the director's remuneration. You would also include in that handbook the code of ethics for the company. You would also include the corporate governance policy, and added to that would be the annual attestation by the directors that they have followed all of the code of conducts and the AML requirements. So normally that's a handbook that once the directors have agreed to sit on a board, they can actually go through it and get an idea of the company's rules, frequency of meetings, how much they're going to be paid, what policies are up for review, which policies have already been reviewed. And so when they look in the board package, they can say, all right, so last quarter they would have reviewed these 4 policies, and they can go to that last meeting and look at those policies and read those policies. So normally they say a company secretary role is to make the process as smooth as possible for the directors and to be their independent conscience. So normally the chairman and the directors, if they have questions, they would direct it to the company secretary. And of course, the company secretary always ensure that dividends are paid to shareholders. because they keep the records. So once you're company secretary, there are things you have to do before the meeting and during the meeting and after the meeting. Once you're in this role, after 2 to 3 years, it becomes normal. It doesn't seem like there's a long list of tasks. Like when we go through it now, you actually can do it very quickly. So first you have to notify the directors of the time, the date, and the place of the meeting. You need to prepare the agenda with the chairman, circulate it with the associated papers. Normally, like I said, is 1 to 2 weeks ahead of the meeting. You have to make sure all the housekeeping is done, which means make sure the boardroom has been cleaned, seats have been organized, place settings have been done. If it's a breakfast meeting, make sure that breakfast has been ordered and that you have ordered the food that the directors actually eat. If it's outside, you have to make sure that all of the accommodations are being made, that the room has been booked, it has been paid for, parking is available. Then you have to make sure that there is a clock, there's a timer. You have to make sure that all of the relevant persons who have to present know when they are presenting and that they're on call. Then you need to organize all the advisors to the board. You have to notify, if it is necessary, the Securities Commission or the central bank, depends on the meeting and the purpose of the meeting. You have to prepare a briefing note for the chairman before each meeting. That's a 2-page bullet point. For formal resolutions, these should be prepared in a minute form in a separate detailed agenda. So normally you prepare the agenda, you put it in the board package so that the chairman can read it before the board meeting actually takes place and make whatever corrections. On the day of the meeting, you have to check again that all the items are covered and that all the papers have been made available. You need to ensure that any documents which might be referred to are at hand, such as accounts, memorandum, and the articles of association and any other documentation. So once the meeting begins, you have to be prepared to resist the temptation to speak on anything other than procedural matters. That's it. Or someone may ask you, let's say if they're reviewing a policy and they were saying the last time reviewed it, I don't recall this being mentioned, and you can actually turn to the chairman and said they could refer to the Q2 board meeting in the year of so and so. You don't speak directly to the directors, you speak to the chairman. You have to record the names of the directors present, those who are absent, those who leave the meeting early, those who leave and come back. All of that you have to record. You have to make sure that there is a quorum. If there's any apologies, anybody who's not coming, someone who is sick, you have to record that also. And in the meeting, you have to record all the proceedings, all of the deliberations, and you have to make sure that decisions are arrived at. Because sometimes people may have a long debate, but there's no conclusion, and you have a resolution already drafted. So then you have to point to the chairman that there is no resolution. What was decided? So you have to be prepared to advise on points of procedure. Sometimes you have without invitation or request to inform the chairman of any action that's proposed to be taken by the board, whether it's lawful or unlawful. So sometimes a decision could be made and the board could be going about it the wrong way. And so you have to advise the chairman of the right procedure. You have to make any necessary arrangements for entry for those attendees only present. So when there are other department heads who have to come and make a presentation, you have to be the person who have to let them be lying off outside the room or at their desk, ready for you to send them a text to say, you may now enter. And then you advise them to call the next person in. And of course, you have to ensure the removal of any confidential reports or letters from the boardroom. So at the end of the board meeting, you have, after everyone has left, you have to make sure that there are no papers that are left in the boardroom at all. You also, after the board meeting, you need to see if any of the directors need any additional information, or there is some point of clarification that they required. and they didn't want to ask during the meeting, maybe from a previous meeting. So you have to make sure that you assist them in whatever way possible. So if after the meeting, you're required to send some report or resolution to the regulator, you do that immediately after the meeting. You also advise any department that needed a document to be approved or a particular step approved, you will advise them whether it was approved or not. Anything that was deferred that a department will be waiting on, you need to advise them also. And immediately after, normally within 3 days, the minutes have to be drafted and circulated to the chairman for review. Any questions?
This sounds like a lot.
It is a lot. It's a highly paid job.
I feel like these people make like doing so much more even than the directors.
Yes, they do.
A lot of work.
It's a lot of work. So you can imagine being the company secretary for the company itself and being the company secretary on all of the subcommittees. And also being a company secretary if you have companies that act in a nominee capacity and you provide corporate secretarial service, you have to do minutes for those too. You have to do statutory filing. It's a lot.
I hope they have numerous assistants.
No, normally it's just a corporate secretary and an assistant secretary.
Wow.
So now the minute taking. The minute taking is, I think the best way to say it is an art. Some chairmen like the minute to be written in the present tense. Some prefer it in the past tense. Some like it to be detailed and some don't. So as a secretary, you need to know what to write and when to write it. So you have to be able to decipher a debate. You have to make sure you get the contribution from each director. And you also have to make sure you have the conclusion. That is why when you prepare the agenda and you look at the items that will be discussed, you need to have an idea of what they're going to discuss and what it is about. Because when the discussions begin, you're gonna have to be able to record the salient points that are necessary to come to the conclusion. That sound like sense? Yes, no?
Yes.
So, hold on now. Okay, that's that one. So a lot of people to get in this role, they'll normally, in most instances, it's the legal department. And you start from being an assistant secretary. So as an assistant secretary, you'll be responsible for reviewing the contributions to the agenda. You will be responsible for making sure the boardroom is set up properly. You will be responsible for making sure that all of the board directors have access to their board package. You'll be responsible for chasing all of the various contributors to the board documents, making sure that they're received on time. Responsible for greeting the directors, if it's electronically, greeting them on the telephone, making sure they're there, saying if there's anything else that they need. And at the very beginning, you would be asked to take the minutes along with the secretary and to type your minutes. Just to see till you get the feel of how to type the minutes. And then eventually you'll be typing the minutes. You actually be taking the minutes and typing the minutes yourself without any assistance. So when it comes to being a company secretary, you know, there are some legal considerations. The company secretary owes the company duties of skill and care and diligence in carrying out his or her role and responsibilities. and they could be liable for negligence for failing to exercise a necessary standard. Normally, they are the de facto legal and compliance officer. The company secretary should procedurally ensure, along with the chairman of the board, that the board of directors and other company meetings are conducted in a proper manner, having regard to the law. So, as a secretary, you need to know the type of shares that the company has, whether they're ordinary shares, deferred shares, preferred shares, redeemable shares. You have to know the share capital. You have to know the share, how many were issued. You have to know the share register is what you have to keep. The share certificates, you normally would keep the book for that. The share transfer form, the resolutions are prepared by you. Normally you have a resolution book. And of course, the proxies are prepared by you. The financial statements, as I said before, you have to have some accounting background. You should be able to read a balance sheet, income and expenses, and notes to the financial statements. So you have to know the assets, the liabilities, the net equity, and depends if it's a regulated company, you'll have to know the various ratios. So you'll have to know the debt to equity ratio. You'll have to know the capital adequacy ratio. You need to know all of those things. Because you're the one who's going to point out when the CFO prepares the report, their typewritten contribution, and you notice that, hold on now, the debt to equity ratio is below the required ratio set by the regulator. You're gonna have to be the one that said, oh, oops, you missed this. You have to put it in. So I've given you examples of the balance sheet, the income, the statement of retained earnings, and the statement of cash flow. So also, as the corporate secretary, you need to know the different types of minutes. You have directors' minutes, you have shareholders' minutes, you have general minutes. And of course, you have different types of meetings. The annual general meeting, which is with the shareholders, the extraordinary general meeting, and then you have ordinary meetings. So normally when you have the annual general meeting, which is at the beginning of the year, that normally is done in the middle of a general meeting, an ordinary meeting. So you'll have an ordinary meeting and you stop in the middle and you do the annual general meeting. So now I have a question. Let me see, where's my question? I wrote a question down I have to ask. Where is it? Where is it? It's disappeared from me. It disappeared. Hold on, there's a question I want to ask you all. Oh, yes, I found it. So on a board, you have directors. What's the difference between a dissenting director and an unwanted director?
Maybe the difference between the one director retiring soon as opposed to another one that nobody wants there?
Not quite.
Yeah.
Half and half. Dissenting director and an unwanted director. What's the difference? No guesses? So a dissenting director, they know how to disagree without being disagreeable. They understand where the board consensus is headed, and then they are respective of the board's collective opinion. They're normally outspoken.
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood what you said. I thought you said descending. not
No,
dissent. I'm so sorry.
dissenting.
Okay. Forget that I said that.
Okay, so tell me, what is a dissenting director then?
I'm saying, okay, in that case, one director, you can respect his opinion, even if it's different from yours, because he's respectful of all of the others, as opposed to another one that might not be willing to
Right.
listen to other people and hear their opinions and think that they're always right and not open to other views and opinions on a matter.
Right. So a dissenting director is outspoken, but they respect other contributors. So while some fellow directors or management may lack the patience to hear them out and may want to railroad the discussion, these directors should be heard. Indeed, letting them lay out their entire thought process sometimes is a good way to see whether or not the board is missing anything. But an unwanted directors are a different breed. They normally ask academic questions and full of non sequitur. They ask for too many granularity and too much generality. They pontificate on their own experience, trying to demonstrate how smart they are. Sometimes they'll pull out their calculator to search for inconsistency in a financial report. And sometimes they'll stop the discussions. So how do you deal with an unwanted director? Normally, the rest of the board have the responsibility to rein them in. The CEO can't stop the questioning because that will seem defensive. The fellow directors have to step up. They have to redirect the dialogue, or else it will become impossible for the board to get anything done. If more directors speak up, it will become more evident that the weight of dialogue has shifted away from the unwanted director. And if that doesn't work, they would normally ask the chair to deal with the director who's being disruptive. So they either could have an offline conversation, or they could ask the nominating committee to renominate the unwanted director, which means ask for their removal. So I had another question for you now. So very often discussions of important matters such as strategy, succession, and external trends are squeezed in around the edges, leaving directors and CEO dissatisfied, which means that the board doesn't spend enough time on dealing with these matters. Compliance is a necessity, but it doesn't make a board a competitive advantage. Because you notice in most boards, everything is directed towards compliance. One way to consider that the board is talking about the things that really matter. It is a way to test whether directors are really on top of the things that could make or break a company. And there are some things that the directors should think about. There's some questions. 10 questions every director should ask. First question, do you have the right CEO? Why do you think that's the first question?
Because the CEO manages the company.
Uh-huh.
Like they play a key role in how the company is operating and how the company is going to perform.
Exactly. So the CEO is the one who makes the competitive advantage. What value are they going to bring to the organization? But another thing is this, who selects the CEO?
The board appoints the CEO, doesn't it?
Yes. But the appointment, by appointing, how do you go about appointing a CEO?
Don't they have to apply for the position?
They have to apply for the position, yes, and then what?
And then it needs to be accepted or not?
By whom?
The
That's the tricky
previous,
question, eh?
yeah, not unless the CEO appointed a successor.
Mm-hmm. But don't you think the board should be looking for certain qualities?
Yes.
So the board has to look at certain qualities to see if that person fits in their strategy and be able to achieve the goal that they're trying to make.
So wouldn't they just do it like a general, like any sort of, like if you're applying for a position, wouldn't they just basically go through the same kind of like interview process of seeing if you'll fit with the strategy that they're trying to achieve and if you will,
Yes,
benefit the company?
exactly. But normally they say you shouldn't leave it to the sitting CEO. You should let the directors go through and see if that person will fit into the company's strategy. So the second question a director should ask themselves, how well is the CEO's compensation linked to actual performance? How well is the CEO's compensation linked to actual performance? These directors need to be clear on how compensation reflects the board's philosophy and the company's actual performance. So you have to look at the performance measurement. Is it clear? And will the compensation plan encourage the right behavior? Now, in a lot of the scandals that happened in the past 20 and odd years, they always talk about the CEO's compensation package. If the CEO retires early, what's the total value? The compensation plan must remain fundamentally relevant under the circumstances. So you have to think about what package are you going to offer the CEO? The third question is, do you have a precise understanding of the money-making recipe in the chosen strategy? So as a director, you need to be able to answer that question. Do you have a precise understanding of the money-making recipe in the chosen strategy? No two companies are alike. Even the competitors in the same segments, they're not alike. They could be similar, but they're not alike. So directors have to understand a company's strategy and how it translates into a money-making recipe. Understanding how a company, a division, or a major product category makes money is crucial. What makes it distinct from competitors, and how long will the competitive advantage last? Will investors value the strategy the way it is intended? Do fellow directors have the same understanding of strategy and money making? Next question, number 4. Is the management team looking at external trends and diagnosing the opportunities and threats presented? Management have to look at the competition from within the industry. They have to look at new entrants, technology changes, new distribution channels, regulation and legislation, activists, global economic trends, and so on. A company's strategy only makes sense within this current and future context. So a board must be satisfied that management has properly assessed external trends, has a plan to address both the emerging opportunities and looming threats, and continues to be exceptionally alert to changes. Question they need to ask themselves: are rival firms getting in or out of one of your key businesses? Is the competitive dynamic within the industry changing? Are there drivers of change in market segmentation? How well are you as a director contributing to the detection of these patterns? Do you think directors ask themselves these questions? Question 5, what are the sources of organic growth? Is the CEO growth plan grounded in reality, not wishful thinking? Has management gone over the plan with the board and kept the board up to date on progress? Is organic growth factored into the compensation package of the CEO and other leaders? Is it good growth? That is growth that is sustainable, profitable, and capital efficient? Question 6, how rigorous is the process for developing the leadership gene pool? The success of the company is directly linked to the right leadership and skill mix at all levels of the corporation. With a superior leadership gene pool, a company will survive short-term bumps in the road and come out ahead in the long term. How comfortable are you with the set of filters through which leaders are selected, promoted, and developed? How often does the board review it? Has management identified trends that will affect the company's future needs? How is management refreshing the leadership gene pool against those needs at all levels? What major investments or initiatives are being made? Question 7, do you have the right approach to diagnosing financial health? Tracking cash is the best way to see how the various parts of the business work together. The idea is to use cash flow to quickly reveal which business units are performing and which aren't, and to detect changes in the pattern. Where is cash coming from? Where is cash going? How do the inflows and outflows work together to create value? Directors must be comfortable that the company will survive should adverse circumstances arise. Boards need to keep an eye on the company's long-term obligations, including its pension funding and off-balance sheet financing. Let a debt burden get too big and a major problem looms if business doesn't work out according to plan. Question 8, are you examining measures that capture the root causes of performance? Progressive boards identify the physical drivers whose performance today will manifest in accounting figures tomorrow. How well do you understand the premise behind each performance measure you see? Question 9, do you get bad news from management in time and unvanished? Is management sharing bad news with the board? If not, why not? If so, is management's plan to address the bad news credible? In some cases, board members have provided sage guidance for management. For example, to settle a lawsuit rather than fight it. This can only happen if management shares the bad news. And 10, how productive are executive sessions? The board can make a CEO more productive, or it can dilute the power of the CEO. Is the board coming to a consensus viewpoint on a handful of most important issues? How accurate and precise is the feedback given to the CEO? How constructive and useful is the feedback? And what has the CEO's response and follow through? What has been the CEO's response and follow through? So you have to ponder these 10 questions as a director. A director who is not completely comfortable with the answers should bring up the issue in executive sessions. The board might want to raise the importance of the issue on the agenda and increase the depth of the dialogue on the topic. And then the same question could then be directed to management. The process of interacting with management over the answers can be illuminating. Discussion on these issues isn't done merely to hear management answers. Directors should unmask the assumptions behind the answers and listen to how those answers are delivered. The process need not and should not feel like an interrogation. What is needed is a conversation, an unscripted exchange conducted in plain language. If that engagement feels stilted, if questions are dismissed or glossed over with platitudes, or if management responds with slick charts and graphs that skirt the tough issues, a director must press on to really understand how the company is performing. Any questions? So if you were on the board and you wanted to recruit a director, what you think you should look for?
Well, it may be good to consider like looking at the board that you currently have to ensure that you have the diversity that you want, and then seeing like if something's missing, like maybe you need more youth on the board, or maybe you need, you know, more male representation or more female representation, then you look for that diversity.
Anything else?
Looking at skill sets, experiences.
Yes. There's some checklists. There's some things when you're recruiting a director. First question: does a prospective director have the capacity to think strategically about the firm's competitive position and thus contribute to the ongoing evolution of the central idea? Remember, when you have a board meeting and you're a member of the board as a director, everything is about strategy. And management itself is supposed to be having the policies and procedures and monitoring the strategy to make sure that they make the profit that the shareholders are looking for. So the first thing is, yes, you look at the composition of the board. You're looking for age, you're looking for sex, you're looking for their background, where they would have worked before. But after you looked at all those things on the top and you interview that person, you have to see whether or not they can think strategically. The second thing is the candidate familiar with and experienced in the specific strategic and execution issues derived from the central idea? Whatever it is that the company is trying to pursue now, that candidate has to buy into that. Does this would-be director have a proven record of working collaboratively with executives at other companies in developing and implementing business practices stemming from the central idea? Remember now, you don't mind having a dissenting director. You just don't want an unwanted one. Will the prospect add intellectual and experiential diversity to the board, plugging weak spots and adding bench strength for guiding the central idea, the strategy, and the execution? Will the candidate be ready to stand tall when vital issues are on the line, the stakes and the stress are high, and direct leadership of the company becomes essential? Because you do have some directors who sit on a board, and when they get to that critical point, they actually resign because they can't foresee what's going to happen next, because they're not thinking strategically. How are we going to direct this company to achieve the strength that we're looking for? Once they cannot see into the future, they resign. Does the prospective director generally add value, real value, not only to the boardroom, but also to the executive suite. So it's not just simply looking at the age, the sex, their diversity, but then you have to narrow it down as, do they have what you're looking for from a strategic point of view? Do they have a good proven record? Do they work as a team player? Do they have the intellectual and the experiential diversity to bring to the board what you're looking for? So if we go back to, remember when I said you have a director and he's not performing, how do you deal with that person? There are certain questions you have to ask yourself. Thing is, do they bring any useful skills? And do they lack the relevant experience to be on the board? Is that director always unprepared? So they either always going through the board package, swiping with their finger trying to find the documents, or they hardly ever make a contribution because they haven't read. Does the director fail to grasp the firm's central idea and business strategy? Are the director's questions distracting or inappropriate? Does the director bring few ideas or leads on business development? Has the board established norms on what is expected of directors in the boardroom? Has the line between leading and staying out of the way been made clear by the lead director and chief executive? Have directors and executives been asked for confidential feedback on a dysfunctional director? And has the lead director privately coached a director whose behavior has been disruptive? So you notice that being on the board is similar to a person who is in an organization. When a director is not performing properly, feedback has to be done, an assessment has to be done, coaching has to be done if necessary, especially if that person can actually bring some value to the board. Any question? I always have a question on the final exam on company secretarial duties. So if I ask you for homework, think about it now. Do you think you could prepare me a checklist for a CEO succession?
As in what qualities you're looking for when you choose a new CEO?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And some of the additional information that we discussed this evening, is that in the additional reading, or are you going to send that to us?
I'm gonna send it to you.
Okay.
I'm gonna send it to you. So I'll send you the checklist for non-performing director. And I will send you the checklist for recruiting directors. For next class, you're gonna tell me what is the checklist for appointing a CEO. And I'm also going to copy for you managing the unwanted director. So you can have a read of that. And then I'm gonna give you the chapter on focusing on substantive issues with the questions, the 10 questions that a director should ask himself.
Thank you.
Okay, so once I do that, you should have an idea where your exam question coming from.
Sorry, Miss Archer, you said that we are just to prepare the checklist for appointing a CEO.
Uh-huh.
What, and you're
What
going to be,
questions?
pardon?
Questions, what questions? If you were to select a CEO for succession, what questions?
Okay, what questions? And then, so in terms of managing an unwanted director, you're going to send us that information?
Yes, because we've
So the
discussed
only-
that already.
Right, but the only homework point is the questions you would ask.
This is a
prospective
director's,
CEO.
right, this is a director's checklist for CEO succession. So remember, we
Okay.
just went over how does a director deal with a non-performing director?
Yeah,
So he asks, first thing he'll ask himself, does this director bring any new useful skills?
Right.
Or do they lack experience? His next question is this person come to the board meeting unprepared? Next question, does this director grasp the central idea or the strategy what we're trying to achieve? Does this director ask a bunch of questions, distracting questions, inappropriate questions? So now I want you to do a checklist for me as to what a director would ask for a CEO succession.
okay. And then I noted in the last class, you were going to send, I think, the history of banking in the Bahamas and wealth management.
I'm gonna
Did-
find it. Remember, I told you I have to look for it.
Oh, okay, I just want to make sure it wasn't sent and I
No.
didn't see it.
No, it wasn't sent. I have to look
Okay.
for it.
Okay,
'Cause I know I've seen it before in a digest. One of those Depute publications.
okay,
And I have to look to see if I still have it, but I'm gonna look for it. I'm gonna look for it for you. I did not forget.
okay.
I just need to pull them all down and see which one is in it. I hope I still have it.
Okay,
Okay. So next week class is on risk. I want you to read it. We're gonna talk about risk from a corporate governance perspective. You see, the next topic is on risk management and corporate governance. So we're gonna
Yeah.
talk about risk from a corporate governance perspective.
okay.
So I have to look this up. Because I started to pull down my book, so I must fit this on my computer. That's the weekend thing for me to look for that for you all.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So I'll make the copies and then I will send them to Mr. Pratt for you.
Thank you. I also
Yes.
have one other unrelated question,
Go ahead.
if you don't mind.
No, go
In,
ahead.
okay, in terms of real estate that is owned by a company and the shares of that company are transferred, so essentially the ultimate beneficial owner changes, but the owner of the real estate technically is still the same company. Is there any reporting required in terms of having to pay VAT or any stamp tax, or do that sort of, or do you have to apply for an exemption as with, say, if you're putting a house that you own into the name of a trust?
Okay, so you said it's a real estate company and it's owned by another company.
Sorry, no, it's real estate owned by a company. So say if you had a house that was in a company name, and instead of changing the owner of the company to be reflected as a new owner per se, the conveyance doesn't change, but just the shares of the company holding the real estate, does that incur tax when you transfer the shares of the company itself that owns the real estate? So nothing changes to the conveyance of the property.
So how do you transfer the shares without changing the company?
You would transfer the shares of the company, but the company stays the same. It's just a different owner of the company.
We talked about this before, and I think the answer was yes. You have to pay
Yeah,
the
it's a transfer.
yeah, you have to pay the value on the transfer, on the share
Mhm.
transfer. There's something specific on that in the act when it
Okay.
comes to the transfer of shares in a company that owns real property.
Okay. So can you apply for an exemption on that? Like, are there any
On what
exemptions?
grounds?
Say if it's to transfer out of your personal name into a trust, if you're gonna be the same ultimate beneficial owner,
Mm.
or if you're
I
giving it to a family member, so.
But I
if-
think the trigger, isn't the trigger transfer?
I thought the trigger, go and have a look, because I thought it was only if there was a change in the ultimate beneficial ownership. So if the ultimate beneficial ownership remains the same,
Then it
It
won't, yeah,
doesn't
there won't,
correct.
yeah, there won't be a charge.
but go check, because like I say, there's a specific section in one of the amendments that deals with that.
In the amendments, okay, thanks.
And there's many amendments.
Yeah, I don't recall it being in the original.
No, it's not.
Right.
It is in one of the amendments. But it's so many. Because remember
Okay.
the last time when you brought this up, then I went to the act and said, oh my God, look at all of these amendments. Why don't they consolidate these things?
Oh, yeah, okay.
There's a lot.
So, but the long and short of it is you would incur tax if the ultimate beneficial owner is changing.
Yes, automatically. Automatically. But if it didn't change, then you shouldn't have to pay.
Okay.
And now to find that, I don't know which one that'll be, maybe 17.
So how does it work if it's
Yeah.
just at the share certificate level and, the property is recorded as being owned by this particular company?
I don't understand what you mean. What you mean?
Because the owner of the property on paper or, on the conveyance isn't changing,
Mm-hmm.
just the individuals behind the company. So that's what I'm wondering. How do they track that?
That's what I'm trying to figure out what. Okay, so you're saying that the company that owns the property, the actual persons behind it was Mary and Sally.
Yeah. And
But
say if,
so the company still exists, but Mary and Sally transferred their ownership in the company to Brian and Tom.
yeah,
Mm,
but the company's still recorded as being owned by the company.
yeah, still recorded as having the same company, but it's
Yeah.
just that the ultimate beneficial owners in person have changed.
Yeah.
Mm. I see.
Or even, say, just added more shareholders.
Okay.
Is-
I did not, sorry.
Okay, I get your question now. That's a different question. So the company itself has transferred its shares to other individuals, but the company remains.
Yeah.
Mm,
How does the tax work in that case?
okay,
Because the land is still recorded at the end of the day as being owned by that same company.
company, yes, just that the individuals behind the company have changed.
Right.
Okay, all right, so I gotta look for the amendment.
Okay.
All right,
Thanks.
so I'll look for that one along with my history, see if I can find my history for you. Okay, all right,
Thank you.
okie dokie. All right, so no other questions. You all seem to be quiet. It means you're gonna love. I should put 2 questions on the exam on board. You all look like you all love this topic.
I think the materials that you're gonna send will be helpful though, because they weren't included on the like the chapter package, but they're gonna be really helpful in.
Yeah, I'm gonna see if I can scan those tomorrow and then send it to you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm. But it's a good area. If you're good at taking minutes and if you like to listen and you're really good at procedures, it's a great career. People normally stay in that position until they retire. So you can think about it. Yeah, don't sound like there's no takers for that. You all went too quiet on me. All right, so I can send these to you all. I'll scan these and send it to you all. And then we'll go
Thank
from
you.
there. All right. So have a great evening.
You too, Miss Archer. Thanks, everyone. Have a good week.
Yes. Have a great week.
You
Okay.
all as well.
Yes.
Evening.
Good
Okay,
evening.
evening.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay.